Hello everyone, it's time for Sunday School. The lesson that we're looking at this time is for Sunday, May the 3rd. Now there's only 4 lessons left in the study of Romans and in May after this lesson. So you need to, in the next couple of weeks, make an arrangement to get the next quarterly here at the church, have somebody bring it to you or call me so that you can come by and get it. The next study is on Proverbs and Song of Songs. So you'll want to go ahead and start getting prepared for that in the next couple of weeks. Now tonight, for today, we are in chapter 11 of Romans, and we're continuing our study. It's been a very good study, and tonight's lesson is the same. It's a good lesson. Now, some of the scriptures are kind of hard, and you can bog down in them, but our lesson does a good job of getting to the heart or to the sweet spot, and it helps us by simplifying a little bit. Now, on the one hand, it hopefully is something that you're familiar with. You know the concepts. That should be easy for you. But I think the emphasis needs to be emphasized again and again and again, and that's what he's doing for us, is letting us know that salvation is an act of God. The lesson is entitled Mercy, and the summation is the gospel continues to be offered to all people, Jews and Gentiles. And then in this particular lesson, it ends with the same thought. When we get to the end, it says everyone has the opportunity to trust Christ. Now he tells us that ask us to remember when we were being chosen for a team, whatever team it might have been, kickball, baseball, whatever you'd be chosen for in the neighborhood with the kids. Everybody wants to be picked. Everybody wants to be included. And we need to think about that, because this lesson has to do with inclusion and exclusion. In fact, I read a book this week, and it talked about why phones are so important to people today. And really it boils down to the fact that we become important, we become somebody. The world revolves around us because everything comes to us through these cell phones that we use these days. And it boils down to our own involvement in our society and our communicating. We all want to be chosen, and that's what we're thinking about this week. Now, we have 3 things to look at in our context, or remembering what we've done before in order to get to the lesson today. In chapters 9 through 10, Paul emphasized salvation through faith. And then he also emphasized the universal nature of God's offer of salvation. That's in chapter 10. So salvation is by faith, and it's for everyone. And then we get a section on the stubbornness of the Jews. That's in this parenthesis we talked about last time. And that's where we are still today. So despite their stubbornness, Paul knew that God had not given up on the Jews. And that's something to think about right there. It may be that even in the midst of our stubbornness and our rebellion, we might need to be reminded that God doesn't give up on us. He's still trying to reach us. And that is indeed a good word for us. Now, our scripture text from chapter 11, verses 17 through 21 is broken down into 3 parts. The first part is be humble. The second part is be thankful. And the third part is be aware. In 17 it says, now if some of the branches were broken off, and you, though a wild olive branch, were grafted in among them, and have come to share in the rich root of the cultivated olive tree, do not boast that you are better than those other branches, those that have been cut off. You need to remember that the root sustains you. You don't sustain the root. It would be good to remember that in Genesis, Adam and Eve had an option to eat from all the trees in the garden, and they had to be expelled from the garden after eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because God didn't want them to eat the tree of life and then live forever. And so here we're seeing how people are grafted into God's people, to salvation, and the illustration is a tree. So it's just a little interesting tidbit for you. Now, I want to make sure that you don't take the illustration and push it too far. You can do that. You can take it out of context. We want to be careful not to do that. It is Paul using an illustration that his readers would have readily understood. He's talking about an olive tree, and he's talking about branches that have been broken off and others that have been brought in. But the branches that are brought in and grafted into the tree are wild branches. And that's not the way that farming took place. The wild branches would be cut off, and good branches would be grafted in. God often works in the reverse of the way we think things ought to be. And so what we have here is the instruction for us to be humble. We need to be humble because we're not somebody so important that we're better than other people. Paul feared that the grafting process would leave the Gentiles with a superiority complex. And so he's working hard to remind them that their salvation is fully dependent upon God. They didn't do anything to earn it. They didn't do anything to deserve it. It's all a matter of God's grace. And so they are brought in and they are sustained by God. The only standing the Gentiles had was through grace, through faith. And that certainly hasn't changed. And so he says to us, don't be arrogant, but be aware and be careful. Sometimes today, even in our various Christian groups, some of us will say we're better than others, or they don't have the whole truth, or they're wrong and we're right. We need to be careful with that because all of us are dependent upon grace. Now our Bible skill here is inserted at this point, and it's to use a Bible dictionary again. This has been mentioned every week that we've done a lesson, and you need to get a good Bible dictionary. And here it suggests that you look up the word graft, like grafting in agriculture, and to study it a little bit to help understand the imagery that Paul is sharing. The second point is to be thankful. Therefore, consider God's kindness and severity. Severity towards those who have fallen, but God's kindness toward you, if you remain in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. Now, we have to be careful. We're not looking here at falling from grace. We're not looking at once saved, always saved. That's not it. This is one of those places where you can get out of context. Go back to chapter 8, you find out that God has settled the issue of salvation. And so he's talking about the experiences that we have with God, and he's reminding his readers, his Gentile readers, that they have still been brought in by grace and they need to be thankful for it. So what he's looking at and what he's talking about is balance. And he's asking them to examine God's perfect balance between kindness and severity. God is not so kind that he overlooks evil, and he's not so harsh that he condemns without cause. What we're seeing here is a measured approach to God, a balanced approach, and we need to make sure that we live in that reality still today. And then he says something here that's pretty important, our lesson writer does. Despite their stubbornness and rebellion, Paul reminded his Gentile readers that the unbelieving Jews were not hopeless. Now, a lot has happened. A lot has happened. The Jews, as we know, were temporarily blinded or set aside. Their hardness of heart was partial, but it was enough that they were moved aside. And Paul says that's so that the Gentiles could come in. Now, the reason we say it's partial is because individuals like Paul can still be saved, and the Jews today are still being saved. The big picture is that they have moved away from grace and still trying to measure up to law and perfection. They're not experiencing grace. And Paul is reminding his readers that, yes, there is that blindness to God right now, but it's not complete and it's not going to last forever. God hadn't given up on the Jewish people. They were not hopeless. I wonder if that doesn't translate to folks that we know, friends, family members, people that have rejected Christ and rejected Christ and rejected Christ. maybe we need to keep praying for them, because they, like the Jews, are not hopeless. There's still a chance for God to reach out and to win them over to Him. Keep praying for them. And don't consider yourself superior, because you're not. You're just dependent upon God's goodness and His grace. And they are too. So pray that they would experience God's grace. In fact, that is the doctrine for this lesson. The key doctrine is God's purpose of grace. Now, he talks about election in this description, and that's good. You can do that, but sometimes the word election throws people off. So here's the whole sentence. Election is the glorious display of God's sovereign goodness. That's what His grace is, the display of His goodness. And it is infinitely wise, holy, and unchangeable. Therefore, it excludes boasting and promotes humility. And your key point here is Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. The third part of this lesson is be aware, and that's verses 25 through 32. Paul said, I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you will not be conceited. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. Paul didn't want his Christian brothers and sisters in Rome to be ignorant of God's plan. God had a plan. The plan was to include the Gentiles. It is to include the Jews. It always has been. In fact, in Genesis, we find that God's promise to the whole world was to come through Abraham and through his children. God hasn't changed that. He hasn't changed His mind. And so what we are seeing here is that partial hardening that will change at some point. In other words, the Jews are not lost forever. They have a chance to accept Christ by grace. And then he reminds us that these promises that God has made are irrevocable. They cannot change or be altered. And they will not in any way. Now there's a little line right here for you to write in your book and say, and answer this question. What does God's plans, being irrevocable, tell us about His character? What do we learn about God? Because His plans don't change. Well, it tells us a lot about God. And you have just a couple lines. Fill that out and do that good exercise. And then understand that salvation is offered to all in faith. And it is our hope that all people would receive God's mercy. The door for God's mercy is open to everyone and to anyone. And remember that everyone has the opportunity to come to Christ through faith. Everyone. So we have a good lesson reminding us how salvation works, how it's for all of us. And let's not be arrogant or conceited in our relationship with God, but rather be humble and be thankful, because we are all in the presence of God solely by His grace. God bless you.